A wild Mustang's second chance. How one woman's courage changed everything. The morning mist clung heavily to the open fields, swallowing the distant fences of the old farmhouse. Eleanor Hayes, a 72-year-old widow, stood on her wooden porch, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The land around her was once alive with the thunder of hooves, the echoes of laughter, and the rhythmic sounds of saddles and bridles. But now it was quiet, too quiet. It had been 8 long years since she last heard the gallop of her beloved horse, Rustler. He had been her one true companion, the one who never left her side until fate took him away. She never replaced him. The pain was too much. Eleanor sighed and turned to go back inside when something in the distance caught her eye. A dark silhouette moved awkwardly through the fog, stumbling with each step. At first, she thought it was a stray deer, but as it got closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a Mustang, a wild stallion, thin as bones, with patches of dried mud covering its golden-brown coat. Its ribs pressed sharply against its skin, and each step looked heavier than the last. Eleanor's heart pounded. "Where did you come from, boy?" she whispered, stepping cautiously forward. The Mustang's legs wobbled, and then, just a few feet from her front porch, his body gave out. He collapsed with a heavy thud, dust rising around him. Eleanor dropped her coffee cup, and it shattered against the wooden floor. This horse wasn't just weak. He was dying. She didn't hesitate. Barefoot and in her old nightgown, she rushed forward, kneeling beside the stallion. His nostrils flared weakly, his eyes half closed, his body trembling from exhaustion. Her hands trembled as she touched his neck. His skin was burning, dehydrated, malnourished. He had pushed himself to his very limit, and now he had nothing left. Eleanor's mind raced. There was no one else around. If she didn't act fast, he wouldn't survive the next few hours. She suddenly remembered the last time she had knelt beside a horse like this, when Rustler had taken his last breath in her arms. The memory was a sharp pain in her chest. "Not again," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I won't let you die." She ran toward her barn, her heart pounding, knowing she was about to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the open fields in a ghostly silence. Eleanor Hayes, a 72-year-old widow, stood on her creaky wooden porch, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. The farmhouse behind her was quiet, too quiet. It had been 8 years since she last heard the thunder of hooves, the sound of her beloved horse, Rustler, galloping across the fields. He had been her rock, her companion, her everything. But when he passed, she swore she'd never let another horse into her life. The pain was too much to bear. As she turned to go back inside, something in the distance caught her eye. A shadow moved through the mist, stumbling and unsteady. At first, she thought it was a deer, but as it drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. It was a Mustang, a wild stallion, his golden-brown coat dull and caked with mud. His ribs jutted out sharply, and his legs trembled with every step. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Where did you come from?" she whispered, stepping cautiously forward. The Mustang's legs gave out just feet from her porch. He collapsed with a heavy thud, dust rising around him. Eleanor's coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the wooden floor. This horse wasn't just exhausted. He was on the brink of death. Without a second thought, she rushed to his side, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his neck. His skin was hot, his breathing shallow. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and barely clinging to life. Eleanor's mind raced. She was alone, miles from anyone who could help. If she didn't act fast, he wouldn't make it through the day. Memories of Rustler flooded her mind. The way he had looked at her with trusting eyes, the way he had taken his last breath in her arms. "Not again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't let you die." She sprinted to the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and hay. The place hadn't seen a horse in years, but muscle memory took over as she grabbed a bucket, an old horse blanket, and a weathered leather halter that had once belonged to Rustler. "Stay with me, boy," she murmured as she rushed back outside. "Just hold on." The Mustang was exactly where she had left him, his breathing slow and uneven. She knelt beside him, carefully lifting his head onto the folded blanket. The weight of his skull in her hands sent a shiver down her spine. She had done this before, 8 years ago with Rustler. But this time, she wasn't saying goodbye. "Not today," she whispered. "Not again." She hurried to the water trough near the barn, the pump squeaking as she worked the handle. Cool, fresh water poured out, filling the bucket to the brim. She rushed back, sloshing some onto the dirt in her haste. The Mustang barely reacted. Eleanor felt a sting of fear in her chest. He was worse off than she thought. If he was too weak to even lift his head for water. No, she thought, I won't let that happen. Sinking to her knees, she dipped her hand into the water and gently cupped it against his dry, cracked lips. For a few seconds, nothing happened, but then a flicker of instinct made him part his lips slightly. His tongue barely touched the water. It wasn't enough. Eleanor thought fast. She dipped the corner of the blanket into the bucket, letting it soak up the water, then gently pressed it to the horse's lips. Slowly, he licked the damp fabric. "That's it," she murmured. "Just a little more." Over the next 2 hours, Eleanor fought to keep him alive. She cooled his burning skin with damp cloths, coaxed him to drink a few more drops at a time, and never left his side. The sun began to rise, turning the sky into a wash of pale pink and gold, but she barely noticed. Her arms ached, her knees were sore from kneeling on the ground, but she didn't care. For the first time in years, her hands were touching a horse again, and she would not let this one slip away. By mid-morning, the Mustang's breathing had steadied. He was still weak, but there was a change, a subtle shift in his body, a flicker of life that hadn't been there before. Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She knew he wasn't out of danger yet. If he didn't eat soon, he wouldn't make it through the night. She stood up, feeling every bit of her 72 years, and walked toward the barn. Inside, everything was just as Rustler had left it. The old feed barrels were still there, though the grain inside had long since turned to dust. But tucked in the back, behind some rusting tools and stacks of forgotten tack, she found what she was looking for, a sealed bag of alfalfa pellets, untouched and still good. Her fingers trembled as she carried it outside. The Mustang lifted his head slightly when she returned, his ears twitching. It was the first time he had moved since collapsing. "You smell that, boy?" Eleanor murmured as she poured a small pile of pellets into a tin bowl. The Mustang blinked slowly, his nostrils flaring weakly. She held her breath. Would he eat? After what felt like an eternity, the stallion lowered his head, nudging the food with his nose before taking the smallest nibble. Eleanor exhaled sharply, her eyes misting over. "That's it," she whispered. "You're going to be all right." She didn't realize she was crying until a tear slipped down her cheek. As she watched the Mustang chew, a new thought crept into her mind. Where had he come from? Wild Mustangs didn't just wander onto farms, especially one this deep into the countryside. And he wasn't branded, which meant he hadn't come from the government roundups. Something wasn't right. Eleanor ran a gentle hand over his bony frame, feeling each sharp rib beneath his coat. That's when she noticed it. Faint scars along his flank, barely visible beneath the layers of dirt and grime. They weren't from the wild. Someone had hurt him. Her fingers curled into a fist. Whoever had done this had left him for dead. "Not on my watch," she thought. Eleanor stood to her feet, suddenly feeling stronger than she had in years. This horse had come to her for a reason, and she wasn't going to let him down. Continuation. 8,000 plus words. Eleanor sat on the ground beside the Mustang, her legs stiff from hours of kneeling. She hadn't moved since he had taken his first hesitant bites of food. His ribs still protruded beneath his golden brown coat, but there was a shift in his presence now, subtle yet undeniable. He was here. He was trying. She reached out slowly, brushing away the dried mud crusted around his mane. The horse flinched at first, his muscles tensing under her touch. But then, as if realizing she meant no harm, he relaxed. It had been years since Eleanor had felt the warm weight of a horse's breath so close to her. The sensation stirred something deep inside her, something she had buried the day she lost Rustler. She swallowed hard. "Where did you come from, boy?" she murmured. The Mustang didn't answer, of course, but as she ran her hands gently along his side, feeling the faint scars hidden beneath the dust and grime, she knew one thing for certain. Someone had failed him. Horses from the wild bore the marks of nature, bramble scratches, the occasional old wound from herd disputes. But these scars, they were different. They were deliberate. Her jaw tightened. She had seen things like this before. There were men out there who saw wild horses as nothing more than obstacles, creatures to be broken, sold, or discarded when they were no longer useful. Some ranchers thought the only way to handle Mustangs was to break them down completely, forcing them into submission. And some, if a horse refused to submit, simply left them to die. Eleanor's fingers curled into the Mustang's tangled mane. Not this time, she thought. She wasn't sure what had brought this stallion to her doorstep, but she knew one thing. He had chosen to come here, and she wasn't about to let him down. She stood, stretching out her aching back. The Mustang followed her movement with tired eyes, still too weak to rise. "You need a name," she said, studying him. He was a survivor. He had fought his way here against the odds, refusing to give up. "Strider," she whispered, testing the name on her tongue. The Mustang let out a slow, steady breath. "Strider." It was perfect. Eleanor turned back toward the house, her mind racing. Water and food would help, but he needed more. His muscles were weak, his spirit fragile. If she wanted to save him, she had to act fast. She walked back toward the barn, rummaging through the old supplies. The scent of leather and dust filled her nose as she pulled out the same soft-bristled brush she had once used on Rustler. Memories flooded back. The way Rustler used to nuzzle into her shoulder, huffing softly whenever she stopped brushing too soon. The way his ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice. The way his body had grown weaker toward the end, until the day she sat with him, whispering apologies as he slipped away. She had sworn she would never do this again. Yet here she was, steadying herself. She carried the brush outside and knelt beside Strider. He tensed as she lifted the brush to his side, his skin twitching beneath the first soft strokes. He didn't move away, but his breathing quickened. "It's all right," she murmured. "No one's going to hurt you here." For a long time, she worked in silence, carefully brushing away layers of dirt, revealing the deep golden coat hidden beneath. Strider remained still, his body growing heavier with exhaustion, but something in his posture shifted. By the time she was done, the worst of the dust was gone, and his coat, though still dull from malnutrition, had regained a hint of its natural shine. She leaned back, studying him. "There," she said softly. "Now you look like a horse again." Strider lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking forward for the first time. And then, something she hadn't expected, a sound. A low, soft nicker. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but it was there. Eleanor's throat tightened. Strider was beginning to trust her, but just as the moment settled between them, something shattered the silence. A truck engine. She turned sharply toward the road, her heart pounding as a dust-covered pickup rumbled toward the house. A bad feeling twisted in her gut. Nobody came out this far without a reason. Strider flinched at the sound, his muscles tensing. Whoever was in that truck, he knew them, and from the way his body went rigid with fear, Eleanor knew one thing. Whoever they were, they weren't here to help. The truck rattled as it came to a stop just outside Eleanor's property, kicking up dust in the morning light. Strider tensed, his ears pinned back against his head, nostrils flaring in panic. Eleanor placed a calming hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremors running through his exhausted body. Whoever was inside that truck, he feared them. The driver's side door swung open with a rusty creak, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with worn-out jeans and a leather vest dusted with dirt. His boots crunched against the gravel as he walked forward, his sharp gaze scanning the property. Eleanor didn't recognize him, but she knew his type, a rancher, a man who had spent his life taming wild things. And from the way he was looking at Strider, she could tell he thought that horse belonged to him. "Morning, ma'am," the man said, tipping his hat in forced politeness. "Didn't mean to startle you. Name's Travis Kane." Eleanor crossed her arms, standing between him and Strider. "I don't get many visitors," she said coolly. "What brings you all the way out here?" Travis hooked his thumbs into his belt, tilting his head toward the Mustang. "That horse. Been tracking him for a couple of days. Looks like he wandered off my property." Eleanor felt Strider shift behind her. He was too weak to stand, but his eyes, once dull and lifeless, were now wide and alert, full of fear. She kept her expression neutral. "He doesn't have a brand," she said. "Doesn't look like anyone's horse to me." Travis let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Nah, he's mine, all right. Picked him up a while back from some government call. Was planning to break him in, but, well, Mustangs can be stubborn." Eleanor clenched her jaw. She had heard this story before. Wild Mustangs, captured in brutal roundups, sold off to the highest bidder. Some went to good homes. Others weren't so lucky, and looking at the scars along Strider's body, she had no doubt which category he had fallen into. Travis sighed, as if growing bored of the conversation. "Listen, I don't want any trouble," he said. "I've got plenty of stock, and I ain't got time to be chasing down a horse that doesn't want to be tamed. Just let me load him up, and I'll be on my way." Strider let out a sharp, panicked breath, his hooves twitching against the dirt. Even in his weakened state, he was trying to move away. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. She looked down at Strider, his frail body, his labored breathing, the way his eyes darted between her and the man standing just a few feet away. He was asking her for help. She thought about Rustler, about the promise she had made herself all those years ago, and then she made her decision. "I don't think that's going to happen," she said, her voice steady. Travis blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." "This horse didn't wander off," Eleanor said. "He ran, and by the looks of him, I'd say he had good reason." Travis's expression darkened. "Now, hold on, lady." "No," she cut in, stepping forward. "You hold on." She was old, sure. Her hair had long gone silver, and her body wasn't as strong as it used to be, but she had lived through war, through loss, through the slow ache of time, and she wasn't afraid of some rancher with a truck and a rope. "You see that road?" she said, pointing past him. "You're going to get back in your truck, and you're going to take it far away from here." Travis let out a slow breath, as if trying to control his temper. "I could come back with the sheriff, you know." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You think the sheriff's going to like hearing that you abandoned a half-dead horse on my land?" Travis's jaw tightened. A long, heavy silence filled the space between them. Then finally he scoffed, shaking his head. "Crazy old woman," he muttered. Eleanor didn't move as he turned on his heel, stomping back toward his truck. The engine roared to life, and with a final bitter glance in her direction, he threw the vehicle into reverse and sped away, disappearing down the dusty road. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Behind her, Strider gave a weak, shuddering exhale, as if sensing the danger had passed. She knelt beside him again, placing a hand on his muzzle. "You're safe now," she whispered. "Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." The Mustang closed his eyes, pressing his face lightly against her palm. It was a small gesture, but to Eleanor it meant everything. She had saved him, but as she looked out toward the horizon, something in her gut told her this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot.